Again, real Bible names there, Bithia and Tertullus. Okay, so Bithia is a Christian woman who is in a pretty serious dating relationship with a fellow named Tertullus, which should tell you enough right there. But Tertullus says he's a Christian and is very fun to be around for the most part. But he is never willing to stay at a job for more than 6 months, gets defensive whenever anyone tries to correct him, and only shows up to church every few weeks, even though Bithia has told him she'd like to be more committed to the local church. She's wondered if she should break up with him, but she's decided that she better not be too picky and that if she can just have enough time, she can change him. You ever heard that before? All right, and then last one, Linus and Abaddon. Linus and Abaddon. Yeah, there is a Linus in the Bible, not just in Charlie Brown. All right, so Linus is very concerned about his friend Abaddon, who, unbeknownst to most people, has for years been quietly slandering fellow church members and causing serious division. Linus has confronted Abaddon about it several times, but Abaddon always attempts to justify his behavior. Hey, what did I hear? Wisdom. There it is, right? Didn't see that one coming, did you, right? They all lack wisdom. That's here of a lack of wisdom, right? You have the simple over here, right? That yes, they've got to learn, but there's a lot they just don't know yet. There's the foolish person who's in a very dangerous place. Then there's the scoffer who is really close to being almost too far gone, right? But the good news is, as we'll talk in a minute, the Lord can redeem each of these people, right? We don't want to lose hope for any of them. So let me give you a basic outline here of Proverbs. This is a very basic outline, probably a little too basic. But the preface to the book is chapter 1, verse 1 through 7, which we'll look at more closely next week. That's the preface to the book. And then 1 through 8, all the way to 9 through 18, most of that, with maybe a couple of chapters of exception, most of that is an invitation to wisdom. So God, in his goodness, doesn't just immediately go into, here's what you need to do, and here's what wisdom looks like. He spends roughly 8 chapters telling us, here's why wisdom is so valuable. Here's why it will bless you. Here's why it will glorify me, right? Here's why you should want it, right? It doesn't just immediately go into the instruction. He tells us, here's why on a heart level you should want this in the first place. I think there's a lot of wisdom just in that approach that he uses. Okay, and then the rest of the book, basically, chapter 10 through chapter 31, it's all practical, wise instruction. That's where things, for the most part, tend to start to get way more specific. And we won't be able to make it through the entire book. Let me just tell you that right now in an 8-week class, but we will try to look at some of the main stuff that comes up. Okay, so based on all that, again, without looking forward on your notes, I'd love to hear from you guys. I'm sure many of you have read Proverbs probably multiple times. Why do you think why is it good to study this book? There's many answers to this. Why is it good to study the book of Proverbs? All right, we got Matt in the back and then Dave.
It's applicable.
Yep, there it is. Applicable. We have literally every situation we encounter, right? We can apply something from this book. Dave.
It makes your daily life so much easier that when you encounter situations, you can go to Proverbs and get the wisdom and how to deal with that situation or that individual.
Yeah, for sure. Proverbs, it's safe to say, can save us a lot of heartache. Not all heartache. Right? That's why you need to read the rest of the wisdom books. We'll talk about that in a moment. Right? Not in a prosperity sense, but there's a sense in which if we follow the Lord's ways, oftentimes there's great blessing in that, isn't there? There always is in a sense, but even in an earthly sense, I should say, there's many times great blessing in that. Okay. Anybody else? Why should we study Proverbs? Got a couple more. Luke and then Bill.
I think in times of either like suffering or temptation or things like that, Proverbs provides an easy, like you could just use 1 or 2 verses, just like very quick, very easy passages that come to mind that can help you in those times.
Yeah. What's one that comes to your mind? I'm going to put you on the spot.
I mean, like you said, in the beginning of Proverbs, just the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. To me,
Yeah.
it's that's that's something that comes to my mind, that whenever, I'm studying things or, getting deep into things, really my true wisdom, my true, I guess, I shouldn't trust in my intelligence or in anything in me. It's really, I should follow God.
Yeah.
I should fear him.
Absolutely. Can't hold it in.
One, just since you were talking about specific examples, like Proverbs 21:1 has always been one that's been big for me, where it's as water, you can turn water in your hand either way, so God can turn the king's heart either way.
Yes.
That's always been a good one for me, because you struggle with leadership and either government or just personal leadership of people you work with, your boss at work or whatever.
Yeah.
It's always good to know that it's a reminder, right, of God's sovereignty just in a specific situation. So
Absolutely.
it's a big one.
Absolutely. Okay, anyone else? All right, let me just rapid fire a few some of these which you've already said. Okay, so why study Proverbs? First of all, because all Scripture is God-breathed and profitable. Right, it's a little obvious, but it's good to be reminded of that. 2 Timothy 3:16. It's all breathed out by God. It's all profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that we can be complete and equipped for every good work. All right, that's the main reason we study any book of the Bible. A second reason, number 2, because we need help seeing the wisdom of God's ways. All right, oftentimes in my own life, if I'm struggling spiritually, it's because I'm failing to see God's wisdom and what he's calling me to do. So if you go to letter A there, in addition to the indispensable biblical genres of law, history, prophecy, gospels, epistles, apocalyptic literature, right? We need all of that. Okay, we need all of that. It's all essential. But we also need, at least God has decided we also need the wisdom, and oftentimes closely related with that, the poetry genre, to help us to see the beauty of God's ways and the ugliness of sin in everyday life. Right? As you read a book like Proverbs, and it's true also of many of the Psalms and other books like this, you see God's ways as just really attractive and beautiful. Right? He really points out, this is the kind of life it produces if you follow me, if you trust in me, if you humble yourself. On the flip side, it also exposes us the incredible ugliness of sin that is oftentimes disguised for us by the world and by our own hearts, isn't it, right? Sin, let's just be honest, many times looks attractive to us, even as believers, right? And Proverbs is here to help us pull the mask off of that, and in some ways, right, to even appeal to our hearts, and in some ways even to our imaginations, to help us to see past the disguise, right, and to see the evil that lies behind it, all right? So it's here to help us see the beauty of God's ways, the ugliness of sin. I think this is important. Proverbs helps us not only see what we're supposed to do. I'm on Roman numeral 1 here. Proverbs helps us to see not only what we are supposed to do, but how it reflects the wisdom of God and why it's actually best for us. Okay, so it doesn't just tell us what to do. It does do that, and a lot of the Bible does tell us that. That's a good thing. We thank God for that. But it also shows us how it reflects God's wisdom, right? How we see the goodness of the Lord in this command that he's given us, and why it's actually what's best for us, right? I think, as Shannon mentioned parenting, right? I think any good parent does this, don't they? Right? If you have a little toddler and you probably don't just say, hey, don't touch the stove. Right? You're probably going to add a little more to that, right? Don't touch the stove because the stove's hot, because it'll burn your hand, and mom and dad don't want to see you get hurt, right? You give them the reason. I'm not just shooting commands at you. I'm trying to help you see what's good for you, right? Same with, a teenager as they get older, right? Don't drive 50 miles an hour over the speed limit, right? And you probably don't leave it at that, probably because if you do, you may end up dead, and we don't want to see you dead or something of that nature, right? And I think Proverbs does this quite a bit, okay? So in Proverbs, we're not just told, don't commit adultery, for instance. We are told that. But we're also told, if you do, here's the evil and the ugliness and the hurt that you can depend upon happening, right, in those kind of actions. On the flip side, right, if you're faithful in your marriage, here's the kind of blessing and goodness of the Lord that you can expect to see. Same kind of thing with being diligent in Proverbs, right? It doesn't just say just work hard, right? The Bible does say that in various ways in the New Testament and other places. But it says, hey, if you're struggling with laziness, here's something that might help you out. Go and look at the ant outside. Consider her ways. Look how hard she works. She doesn't even have a boss or anyone telling her what to do. And wow, look at how she has stuff stored up now for the wintertime. I mean, things like this to help us to see, wow, the Lord's ways are good. The ways of sin are evil. And I think this is important because Roman numeral 2, listen closely on this one. We don't usually disobey because we don't know what to do we? At the end of the day, when I disobey the Lord, with some exceptions, it's usually not because I didn't know the right thing to do, right? It's because we fail to see the goodness of God in his command, right? We fail to see, you could say, the wisdom of God and the heart and the good heart of God and what he's giving to us. Wasn't that the case with Adam in the garden? You think about it. It starts off, the Lord says, hey, you can eat of any tree. I mean, what generosity. Eat of any tree in here. These are all mine, but you can have any except this one, okay? Serpent comes along, starts whispering stuff in Eve and his ears, and suddenly they're doubting, well, is God really good? Right? Does he really have our best interest in mind? Is he trying to keep us from knowing good and evil? Is he withholding something from us? And we've all had that experience in our hearts, haven't we? Right? If I follow this, am I missing out on something? Right? Am I gonna, fail to enjoy something that the world says is good? And Proverbs is here to help us see, no, you're not. Okay, that's all a disguise. It's all there to trick us. And it's there to help capture our hearts with the goodness of God, right? With how far better he is just in himself, but also how far better his ways are. On this note, I have a professor in seminary who's been a pastor a long time, and he was doing marriage counseling for a couple, and I forget how long he'd been doing it, but it'd been a long time, and it was not going well. At some point, out of frustration in one meeting, the husband looks at him and says, his name's Dan. Dan, here's what I need. I need you to make me a long list of every possible scenario that I may face in marriage with my wife. And I need you to tell me exactly this is what I'm supposed to do for every single one. This is the situation. And then I can just, anytime something comes up, I can just follow down the sheet, right? And I'll know exactly what to do. You all are chuckling, right? Because you can see the lack of wisdom. And he said, my professor said, I sat there speechless for a moment because he said, I couldn't believe that this guy thought, after all the counseling we'd done, all the issues he'd faced, that I couldn't believe that he thought that his truest problem, his deepest problem was that he just didn't know what to do, right? His deepest problem was what? It was his heart, right? He failed to see that what the Lord had was actually good, and to desire the Lord and his ways above his own self-centered desires, all right? So we need help, all that to say, seeing the wisdom of God's ways. We need help also, number 3, living in light of God in the real world. I have a quote from you here that I'm gonna try to pull up before I forget. But living in God and living in light of the real world. So I'm sure you all have had the experience, probably not as much as me, because I'm not very good at this stuff, but when you plan a project, say a house project in your mind, and you have it all mapped out, this is what it's gonna be, maybe you even draw a little diagram on a napkin or something like that, and then you actually go to do it and you find this is not gonna work at all. This concept I had in my mind looked great. It does not actually fit in the real world, right? And we can encounter that spiritually, can't we, right? We can think, oh yeah, I got this theology down, I know these Bible verses. And then we get in the real world and we're like, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do. I had that experience somewhat as one of my first jobs out of high school. I worked at my uncle's used car dealership, all right? And you can imagine some of the things that I encountered there. I had come from a very Christian environment, which I thank God for, right? I had a Christian home, church, went to a Christian school, and now suddenly, for the first time in my life, I'm thrown into, you could say, the real world among people who couldn't care less that I was a Christian or what I thought. And suddenly I realized there were a lot of situations where I did not know what the right thing to do was. And I made a lot of mistakes. I'll just leave it at that. But the Lord taught me a lot through it. Even my uncle sometimes will tell me, he sees me at Christmas or whatever, he'll sometimes be like, oh man, Luke, I don't know. I just don't know if, like, I feel bad you had to go through that and live through that experience because, you know, he was the owner. He knew what kind of stuff was going on. And I always tell him, it's one of the best things that ever happened to me. One of the best things that ever happened to me, right? Because it helped me see past just a lot of misconceived ideas about what the world was like. It was good. Anyway, here's Ray Ortland, whose book is very helpful, by the way, on this. Well, I'm not finding my quote here. I have page 16. I'm not seeing what I was gonna read. So we're just not gonna read it. We're just gonna move on. Okay, what are some areas of your life? You've already mentioned some. What are some areas of your life where Proverbs helps you live in the real world? What are some things that come to mind? Luke.
For me, I think the biggest one has been, like one of the biggest ones is in Proverbs 15, verse 1. It says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger."
Yeah.
That to me has been huge in my life because, as my parents might know or may not know, I had a problem with holding my tongue, as growing up and into my early adult years, and even still now. But that to me has been huge to really, respond to someone with a gentle answer, whether they gave me that or not. So that's something and that's in every scenario, or it can be in any situation of life. Any person can give you a harsh answer or just, make you a little angry. And then, so that's been huge for me, just in conversations with just friends, family, coworkers, things like that.
Absolutely. What else comes to mind? Yeah, Brian.
One proverb is always, it's always stuck out in me. It was on Proverbs 10:12. Hatred stirs up conflicts or dissension, but love covers all offenses.
Yeah.
Hating doesn't do much good at all. It can lead to really violent trouble, and you got to let go of your hatred.
Absolutely. What else? Ways Proverbs helps you live in the everyday life? Anything come to mind? Yeah, way in the back there. Can't see who that is. So that's my wife. Hello. You're hiding behind Stephen there.
Hello. I can't think of like the exact verse, so sorry, I'm not that spiritual, guys. But I just like how Proverbs is continually pointing you to the heart. And I think so often in my life I see an action and I go, well, that's stupid. Stop being that way. Or like sometimes you can approach someone and they're dealing with, I don't know, a certain sin or something. And it's easy to look at that person and be like, well, that makes no sense. Just do the right thing. Of course, that's not looking at yourself, right? So there's a problem. But Proverbs is just like, no, look at the heart. Like the heart is like deep waters.
Yes.
And a skilled person draws
Person
it
of
out.
understanding draws it out.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think that's just helpful to remember because oftentimes I find myself being simple and not being a skilled person to draw it out,
Yeah, well, we all do. But yeah, guard your heart. It's Proverbs. Guard your heart with all diligence, for from it springs the issues of life, right? The best thing you could do for your Christian life is guard your heart. On that note, number 4 here, one final reason to study Proverbs, because we need to enjoy the goodness of God himself seen in his ways, right? What's the best way if our heart is not where it should be? Just look at the glory of God, especially in the face of Jesus, right? Especially in the face of the wisdom of God, Jesus himself. That's what ultimately changes us. What we don't want to do, and we'll come back to this in a minute, what we don't want to do is turn Proverbs in just a book of to-dos, okay? That can be easy to do with a book like this. Well, if I just do this, get this outcome, right? And it becomes, before we know it, it becomes a bit maybe even self-centered without realizing it. The main thing we want to do in Proverbs is learn to say, wow, look at God. He is so wise. He is so good. He loves me so much because I can see it glorifies him and it's good. It's actually good for me. That's the main thing that we want. Okay, so some tips. I'm going to try to move quickly here. I'm running out of time. Okay, it's tips for studying Proverbs. All right, this first one's really important. Read it as a book of Proverbs rather than as a book of promises, okay? This may be a little confusing at first, but here's what I mean. A promise says what? This is what will happen every time, guaranteed, right? The Bible has many wonderful promises for us, right? We're thankful for that. John 6:37, we can name tons, but all that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. What an awesome promise that is. If you come to Jesus, he will never, no matter who you are, what you've done, he will never cast you out. It's a promise. Proverbs, on the other hand, is more like this. A proverb says this is what generally happens most of the time. Okay, this is in general how the world works, how God has set things up to work, the way that we should seek to go, right? Especially the way that we should seek to be obedient. But we don't want to take from that if I just do this, I will always get this outcome. All right, let me give you a couple examples. Proverbs 10:4. A slack hand causes poverty, generally true. But the hand of the diligent makes rich, okay? Generally true, okay? However, right, we would say, yeah, in general, if you work hard, you're gonna get good results. That's generally true. But you don't have to live very long to realize there are exceptions, right, to that rule. I'm gonna guess that all of you, like me, have had seasons in your life where you've been working very hard, very diligently, and you're not feeling very rich at that point. Okay, there's exceptions to these things, all right? But in general, we should see the value of diligence, and in general, we should expect to see good results when we work hard. Here's another one. Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Let me ask you, is that a promise or is that a proverb? That's a proverb, isn't it, right? I'm sure many of you know many people, and some of you have, I'm sure, have this experience, right? Where someone is a great parent, great godly parent. They're training up their child in the way they should go. They're not perfect at it, but they do a good job. And that child does tragically depart from that way. We don't want to take from that then, right? And I've seen people kind of do this kind of thing, right? Oh, they must have been a bad parent because look at their kid. Well, we don't know that, right? The Lord in his wisdom has some different plan going on. Maybe he's going to save that kid later. I don't know, right? But we don't want to take from that, oh, this person must be a bad parent because their child is not following the way he should go. On the other side, think about this. I'm going to guess there's some of you in this room, or in fact, I know there is, who did not grow up in a godly home. Did not grow up in a house where you went to church, where you were instructed in the ways of the Lord. And yet God said, you know what? I'm going to save them anyway. I'm going to intervene. I'm going to send someone else to share the gospel with them. And here you are today, right? And so we can see that God does make exceptions to these things. This is why we need to read the rest of the Bible, and we'll get to that in a second. But nevertheless, what should we take from that? God has very wise advice for parenting, right? And parents should seek to honor him in that. Okay, letter C. The goal is not so much to be able to guarantee a certain outcome, but to gain deeper appreciation for the wisdom of God and greater skill in his ways. Does that make sense? Okay, the goal is not mainly to be like, well, I just want to see this happen. The main goal is I want to honor God, I want to love him, I want to see his wisdom, I want to embrace it. That should be our main motive as we move forward. I want to pause for questions, but we better keep going here. Okay, number 2, in order to help you stay balanced, this will be helpful, read Proverbs in light of the other wisdom and poetry books, and obviously also in light of the rest of the Bible. Okay, I'm not going to read all of these, but just to give you a flavor here of this, in light of just the wisdom and poetry books, Proverbs, you could say, keeps us from thinking we can expect blessing if we consistently disregard God's wisdom. Okay, it helps us see, okay, if I completely ignore God's wisdom, I shouldn't expect that I'm not going to see some heartache, okay? On the other hand, though, a book like Job, another one of the wisdom books, the Bible, it keeps us from thinking that faithful Christians never suffer, right? It keeps us thinking, hey, because you might be tempted to think, well, if I just live my life the right way, then things are going to turn out great. And Job is there to help us see even the most righteous person on the face of the planet, literally, it says, encounters some of the most deep suffering ever experienced by any human being. It also helps us see that God can redeem that suffering. And as you know, it protects us from thinking that God cannot redeem that suffering. Even if he brings us through dark valleys, we can learn to see his grace, and someday when we get to heaven and on the other side of these things, see how his hand was working. The Psalms, you could say, several of which are wisdom Psalms, keep us from thinking that the Christian life is always joy or always sorrow. Again, a bad kind of light reading of Proverbs, you might think, yeah, if I follow the Lord, I'm going to have a really happy life all the time. Psalms is there to help you see there's many ups and downs in the Christian life, right? You experience all of the emotions and all kinds of situations, and you learn to cry out to the Lord in those. And lastly, I'll just say this one. Ecclesiastes keeps us from thinking that life will always make sense or that we should give up when it doesn't. Okay, sometimes it's really hard. We've all experienced this. Sometimes you go to bed at night and you're laying there and you're like, did this day matter at all? You know, was that just a wash or what? You know, sometimes it just doesn't seem to make sense. And Ecclesiastes is here to say, yeah, that's not just you. Lots of people experience that. But also at the same time, we shouldn't give up in those times, right? What does Ecclesiastes say at the end? Keep fearing God, keep his commandments. This is your duty, right? This is ultimately how, right, you'll see good in the end if you keep following him. So you can go on, Song of Solomon, James, which we just went through as a church, right? It's not a wisdom book, but it's a letter written largely in the style of wisdom book. One I'll highlight real quick is the Gospels, they're, of course, historical accounts, not wisdom books, but they contain many of Jesus' wise words and wise actions, right? And he is the greatest example of how to be a wise person, of course. Jesus, in his words and ways, includes everything we've talked about. We see all of it. But we also see examples of him showing incredible wisdom in real life situations. I've been taking Jeremy's advice and trying to read a little bit of the Gospels every day during my devotion time. That's one of the things that stood out to me is just, man, this guy was so wise. I mean, look at all of these crazy questions they're throwing at him, just literally trying to snare him. Can you imagine how on edge that would make you? Literally trying to snare him in questions constantly. And more than one occasion, we're told he answered them so wisely that they didn't have anything they could say in response. Or that they didn't dare, it says one point, to ask him any more questions because of how wise he had been. And just the way he handles people, so much more wisdom than I often show in my life, right? He sees to the heart much more than I tend to. Anyway, we can learn a lot from Jesus, all that's saying, in case you didn't know that already. Okay, number 3. Here's an important one. While not ignoring age and gender and maturity specific instruction, we want to make sure we read it as a book for all of God's people. Okay, here's why I say this. So many of you probably, that thought wouldn't have even crossed your mind. Sometimes I've heard people say, I had someone say to me one time, I talked on Proverbs at a certain event once, not here, somewhere else. And a guy came up to me afterwards and he said, man, thank you. He's like, it was a bunch of teenagers. He said, this was such a good book for young people, especially for young men. Now, on the one hand, I agree with that 100%. It's a great book for teenagers. It's a great book for young men. But you know who it's also a great book for? Old people. And young women and older women, everybody, all of Scripture, right, is profitable for all of God's people. And so we want to be sure when we're reading sections like, the sections where the father is instructing his son. Just remember, yes, that is, meant to be a father instructing his son. There may be some ways that it's more readily applicable to that kind of relationship. But if you're a mother and a daughter or whatever, there is still plenty for you to learn from that as well. If you go to Proverbs 31 about the wise woman, yes, it's more readily applicable to a woman. But at the same time, if you're a man, you can learn a lot from that about how to be wise, how to be diligent, right? Certainly you would hope that your wife trusts in you the way that the husband trusts in his wife. Anyway, so don't ignore, right? Don't make the secular mistake of ignoring the age and especially gender-specific stuff. But on the other hand, remember, all of God's word is for all of God's people, all right? Okay, and this one might be the most important as we get ready to wrap up here. Number 4, read it in light of Christ and the gospel. Okay, Proverbs is not a book of morals for perfect people. Okay, sometimes I've heard it taught that way, okay? It's not a book of morals for perfect people, but good news for sinners. Jesus is the Savior of the simple, the foolish, and yes, even at times of the scoffer. Okay, this book is not here, again, to just say, well, just kind of do these things, and God will like you, and your life will turn out great. This book is here, like every other book of the Bible, to expose our sin and how we all fall short. All of us, right? All of us are unwise many times. Maybe this week we were unwise in some way. And guess what? Jesus is here for us. His grace is sufficient, right? And not only does he pay the penalty for our sin, but he is also now, through his Spirit, comes alongside us, right? And what are we told in Titus? The grace of God, it trains us for righteousness. It trains us up in godliness. I'm going to read this this quote here from Ray Ortland, if I can find it this time. Here's what he says. He says, the book of Proverbs is a gospel book because it is part of the Bible. That means the book of Proverbs is good news for bad people. It is about grace for sinners. It is about hope for failures. It is about wisdom for idiots. This book is Jesus himself coming to us as our counselor, as our sage, as our life coach. The Lord Jesus Christ is a competent thinker for all times and all cultures. He is a genius, and he freely offers us, even us, his unique wisdom. So more than anything else, what do we want to encounter in this book? The grace of God, right? The goodness of himself. Read it in light of the gospel. Read it in light of Christ. Christ is the fullest embodiment of the wisdom of God. Everything you read here about the wise person, you can see it in Jesus in a greater and more full way. It is who he is. He is our wisdom. 1 Corinthians 1:30, right? He's become wisdom for us from God. He's the wisest human to ever live, the wise person par excellence. I would close my book too soon. I'm going to read you just a little bit more here. Let's not patronize Jesus Christ, he says, as a nice man who gives us warm religious fuzzies while we turn to the, quote, experts, whoever they are, the seriously qualified people for the challenges of real life. Jesus Christ is the shrewdest man who ever lived. Shrewd being used in a positive way there. Jesus Christ is the shrewdest man who ever lived. No one ever outthought him. No one ever surprised him or cornered him in a debate. He was always out ahead of everyone, both his friends and his enemies. Jesus Christ is the best counselor for all people in all seasons of life, right? So we should look to him as we're studying this book. We don't just see it in who he is, we see it in what he's done too. What has he done? He's carried out the wisdom of God in the cross, right? The greatest display of wisdom ever seen, right? 1 Corinthians 1, 18 through 25, you can read that on your own time, right? Is the wisdom of the cross, the plan of salvation, right? No human being ever would have come up with that, right? In the eyes of the world, it's complete foolishness. But to us whose eyes have been opened, we see the wisdom of God in his Son and what he's done.